I am Debbie Nelson with Together SC, and I coordinate all of these virtual learnings we've been doing over the past year plus, and I coordinate the summit, and we are looking forward to having an in-person summit in 2022. And as a matter of fact, we're starting to plan it today, believe it or not. But today you're here to learn about trends in giving. We were fortunate, we have a great partner in Blackbaud, and we are fortunate that we can call upon them for their resources and to help provide training and so forth. And recently they came out with their 2020 Giving Trends. It's an annual, I think we'll hear a little more about that. I think it's an annual survey that they do to help nonprofits kind of reflect on what they're seeing and what you can anticipate, and perhaps how you can actually apply that knowledge to your work. We are fortunate to have with us Stephen, but I would say your name is Steve, or you tend to go by Steve or Stephen?
Steve, unless I'm in trouble, yeah.
Okay, so we're not in trouble so far. So Steve MacLaughlin is here with us today. He is their Vice President of Project Management. He's a Senior Advisor at the Blackbaud Institute. He's an author. I think it's Data Driven. I'm trying to think. It's Data Driven Nonprofits. Surprise, surprise. Data Driven Nonprofits. And he is someone that is truly an expert in looking at the data and reflecting on it. So we are really delighted to have you here today, Steve, to tell us about what you're seeing from last year, which was a unique year, and how that applies to how we go forward. So welcome to Together SC, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Debbie, and thanks for everyone who's joining us today. I have a lot of data, statistics, trends, because that's one of the fun parts of my job, if for those of you might consider data and trends fun. I'm going to talk for 10 to 15 minutes and give an overview, and then we'll spend the rest of our time here this afternoon just answering any questions that you have. So feel free, if you've got questions as we go, type them into the chat box, but we'll absolutely pause after I get through some of this information to answer some questions as well, make this a little bit more interactive. So the information I'm going to share today is from Blackbaud, the Blackbaud Institute's 2020 Charitable Giving Report. It's a report that we've produced for the past decade now. We look at more than $40 billion in fundraising. So unlike a survey where we might ask people how well they thought they did, this is based on actual real data that we analyze. We also look at a little over $3.2 billion in online giving as well, in addition to some other trends. We do a lot of statistical work to make sure that this is a representative sample of the nonprofit sector. So a couple things. What did we find in 2020? The good news is that overall giving grew 2% in 2020 compared to 2019. And if you'd asked me this time last year if giving was going to grow 2%, I would have been really skeptical, given some of the data we were seeing this time last year in the midst of the COVID pandemic. Online giving grew 21% compared to 2019. So some really good double-digit growth. We'll dig into that trend a little bit more. 28% of those online donations were made on a mobile device. That's the highest rate we've ever recorded. And another thing that stood out in all the analysis was we saw some pretty significant year-over-year increases in average gift amounts. As you can see from the chart, the average gift amount for overall was $737, and that was up from $617 in 2019. And online giving, which has always had a very strong average gift amount, also increased. So some positive trends there as well. So one of the things that we do in the report is we break down performance by both size of organization and sector of organization. So in that example of average overall donation amounts, you can see you do have certainly some variation across different sectors, but all of them experience some positive growth in 2020, which is important and something to keep in mind. Similar trend that we saw on the average online donation amount by subsector. Again, some really positive growth in 2020 compared to 2019. One of the other things that we look at is a multi-year trend. So as I noted, overall giving was up 2%, but different types of organizations experienced different types of growth. Large organizations, those that raise more than $10 million per year, were up 5.3%. Medium-sized organizations, those are organizations between 1 and 10 million in annual fundraising revenue, grew 1.2%, but certainly okay, I'm back. That's
You're back, Steve. Sorry.
the wonders of modern technology is that sometimes it doesn't work. So
yeah, you're back. And you might want to open up your slide again. I know you were getting to the smaller, or the organizations that received a smaller donation amount.
Yep. So let me make sure I maximize this. So one of the things that we found in 2020, large organization had some positive growth, medium sized as well, but smaller organizations saw a decrease in giving compared to 2019. We also break that down by different sectors. So again, some different sectors had some positive growth, others did not. Again, given really the magnitude of some of the things that we saw in 2020, it's not necessarily surprising to see these types of swings in the data. From an online giving standpoint, every single organization, sector size we looked at had some really positive growth in 2020. Large organizations grew by 15%, medium-sized organizations by almost 25%, and even smaller organizations over 22%, as well as some really positive 3-year trends as well. One of the things I thought would point out is the data tells an interesting story. So here is the data across Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 of 2020, what happened. In the first quarter of 2020, we saw a slight decrease in giving, just, roughly 0.2%. January and February were actually pretty strong months, and then March is really when you started to see the impact of COVID. In the second quarter of the year, so April, May, June, you saw a significant decrease, 8%. But look what happened to online giving in the second quarter of the year. It grew 36%. And so while overall giving was trending down and events were held and runs and walks and rides and other things were being postponed, really what we saw was this huge increase in online giving during that period of time. And in fact, it helped to sort of hold up some of the giving trends. By the time we get to Q3, we start to see a recovery in overall giving, still down, but not down from the lows that we saw previously. And then by the time we got to Q4, we were back to positive growth in the year compared to the prior year. And throughout that whole time, we continued to see really robust growth in the online giving piece as well. Now, to put the online growth in perspective, this is some data I've been looking at all the way back to 2004. So one of the things that's been true for over a decade, or really 2 decades, is that online giving was less than 10% of overall giving in the US, which oftentimes surprises people. But in 2020, we reached a real moment, and that was that online giving was 13% of overall giving. And so we surpassed 10% overall for the first time. Also worth noting that the US Commerce Department tracks the percentage of overall retail sales that come from online. And as you can see in that orange line, for quite a while, it was tracking in a very similar way to online giving. So again, we may perceive that doesn't everyone buy everything online. As it turns out, people do buy a lot of things online, but it's still a relatively small percent, less than 15%. And that's a similar trend that we've seen with the online piece, but really a significant increase in 2020. And we expect that to continue to hold up over time as well. Also worth noting, we've continued to see steady increase in the percentage of online donations that happen on a mobile device. Last year, it was 28%, and as you can see here, that's gone up from just 9% 2014. So again, the days of asking, well, do we really need to be mobile friendly, and do we need to pay attention to that? Yeah, and we're approaching almost a third of online giving happening on those devices, and we would expect that to increase, continue to increase over time. So that's a sort of an overview of a lot of info all at once. What I find is helpful are the questions that you have, or things that these trends or those types of things may have brought up. So happy to take questions, and we'll go from there.
You can certainly put your question in the chat box, or we're a relatively small group. If people could even unmute, Ben, I'll let that to happen. Thanks, Ben, for doing that. Is there anyone that has a comment about what they saw or what they heard from a friend, Steve?
I'll speak up, if that's okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Hey, Steve, it's Lori. Hey. We work together, so I'm wearing a different hat. And for this webinar, I'm wearing my board chair hat from Pattисon's Academy. So that is the hat I'm wearing, even though I work with Steve at Blackbaud. We just had our big peer-to-peer fundraising event last weekend. And it was a successful event, first in-person event. And I'm not sure if your data goes into that level of detail, but one of the things we're thinking about is where the future of peer-to-peer is as a subset, within online. We had some dips in our individual fundraising, and we think, and again, this is a level of detail that you might not be able to get to, but might be good for the group. We had some dips in our individual fundraising teams, and we think that it's a function of social media and the changes in the algorithms and the sharing, and things are just not getting shared the way that they used to so easily. So I'm just curious, if you have any thoughts around peer-to-peer. It was a weird year, so I don't know if trends are going to really be helpful to really understand. So just wanted to throw that question out there.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Lori. So peer-to-peer fundraising. So this idea of run, walk, rides, or other virtual type of events has been around for probably the most part of several decades before it used to all be analog on pledge sheets, and now it's online. We did certainly see an impact there in 2020, in particular, a lot of organizations who used to do in-person events, just obviously having to completely pivot, and that impacted those organizations from a revenue standpoint with those larger type of events that they traditionally ran. I do think you want to think about in 2021, how are you seeing performance compared to what you saw last year? Certainly the data that we've seen through the first quarter of 2021 shows us that we continue to see some positive growth trends, which is good. It's a continuation of some good tailwinds that we saw towards the end of 2020. But I think though, the peer-to-peer space, certainly drives a tremendous amount of giving. I think you want to make sure though that as you're engaging with donors and supporters, is that where their preference is? Are those the types of things that they really want to focus on? And certainly just comparing, are you seeing the same donors over and over? Are you able to engage those donors to participate in other ways of the organization too? Does that help?
Yeah, it definitely does. Thank you.
Yep.
I see a question that somewhat relates though to what you just shared from Joe. It says, how are the trends looking this year? versus last year. Is there anything else you would highlight for that, or is it too early to tell?
I mean, I think we're pretty cautiously optimistic. As I said, I've just looked at data from January, February, and March, and even just some of the April data, and we continue to see, positive trends. We've started to see a recovery in giving to smaller organizations, which had a pretty rough go, to be fair, in 2020. We're still talking about single-digit growth rates for overall giving. And I think what will be interesting, especially when we get through the next few months, we'll actually be comparing 2021 versus 2020. And do we see that same, it's unlikely we'd see that same massive increase in the online giving, but it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Others have questions. I have a question, and I always have questions, but where you saw that decline in the amount of giving, and particularly in the smaller giving, the groups that are smaller, and I would say a lot of our Together SC members would fall into that arena. So, we saw shifts. Like, it was interesting. I saw that in human services went up, actually, right?
Yeah.
Which is what you would expect during a pandemic, right?
Yeah.
Because we're seeing the services that need to go directly to human. But you're seeing where there's some trending downward. Do you think those will recover, or do you think those are more permanent changes just as a result of this big, big adaptive change we've all made?
Yeah, it's a great question. Certainly when we have these types of episodic events, we will see a shift. So not surprising to see a big increase in human services giving. We saw the arts and culture sector was impacted pretty hard in 2020 because a lot of their sources of revenue and things like that, in-person memberships, visitation, really were impacted pretty significantly. That's why I think it's important for us to sort of think a 2 or 3 year trend. So let's look and see, what does the recovery look like in 2021 and 2022? But at some point, you should see these organizations and these different groups return to some positive growth territory.
I have a question.
Sure.
So for smaller organizations, do you have anything on like what fundraising strategies kind of worked the best for them, and kind of how to capitalize on those fundraising strategies, just to kind of compensate for the lack of fundraising from the past year?
Sure. Yeah, a couple things we noticed. One, organizations that didn't stop asking, that continued to run their programs, continued to communicate and engage, performed better. Oftentimes when these episodic events happen, there might be a tendency or advice from the board or others are like, oh, we need to pull back and we need to stop, and because of what's happening. But in fact, organizations that continued their outreach, their engagement, their donor communication, and continued to ask. And unlike other, things that we've had in the past, natural disasters or other types of things, the reality is COVID impacted every nonprofit in different ways, right? If you were an arts and culture organization, it could be an impact to people coming to the museum or the aquarium, or becoming members or not renewing that membership. For other organizations, it could just been, hey, our mission is still important. We need that support. And so I think it's still always really important to make sure you're engaging. And then the other thing, and this is more, I would say, qualitative than quantitative, but wherever possible, when you're communicating and engaging, that you're doing two things. One, that you're making it clear the impact that donor can have on the mission, and some examples of some things that maybe you've had to do or are continuing to do as a part of in 2021, and that when you're telling stories and painting that picture, that the donor is the hero in the story, right? Because of your gift last year, we were able to continue to do this, or here's an example because of your generosity that we were able to do, and pointing out that that need still remains in 2021. And that, I think that's more of the qualitative piece that goes in hand of looking at all the data. Does that help?
Yes, definitely.
Great.
Any other questions from folks?
Great. So the full report, as you can see from the URL here, is at blackbaudinstitute.com/charitable giving. Free to download. A lot more information in there as well. And again, we publish updates pretty regularly on the Blackbaud Institute website. So you'll find some other, I think, helpful and insightful research there as well. And so appreciate everyone's time here today, taking maybe a bit of time out of your lunch hour or part of your lunchtime to talk about data and trends and you know, some of the interesting things that we saw last year, but what we're going to see in 2021.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for sharing this information with us today, and thanks everyone for joining us. We'll definitely include the link to the full report in the follow-up email along with the recording of this call. Oh, we do have another question came in from Tabitha. She's asking, are there any best practices that small organizations can employ from larger organizations?
It's a good question, and one I've gotten a lot over the years. You know, I really do believe that, you know, a smaller organization, and I've been on the board of a smaller nonprofit in the past, really, you know, you have an opportunity for a much more meaningful, direct communication and engagement with your supporters. And so again, always trying to communicate to them of what's happening and the impact of their giving to the mission, and telling those stories, making them the hero as part of those stories. And I think the other just key piece is just, you know, continuing to look at how do we become the organization of choice for our donors. They have lots of options. How do we make sure that we're their preferred choice? And I think in many ways, smaller organizations have an opportunity to show that, because in a lot of cases, the giving can have a more direct impact. And there are certainly donors who are looking to make those gifts of impact that appeal to them in those ways.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Steve, again, for sharing this with us. And wish you all a happy afternoon. And we'll see y'all on the next call.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Steve.